Yo, today I'm doing a track breakdown of my song Defiance, which is out now on various platforms linked in the description. You can skip to this timestamp if you want to skip all the history of this song and just get into the track breakdown. Alright, so the inspiration for this song is a type of music I've been listening to for a while now, mainly made by this artist here. Another artist, Drones, has been making that quite recently with this EP here, and I decided I wanted to do that too, while also taking it just a bit further, not only messing with chords but also with time signatures, which is something that Phonon does quite a lot in his music. The main difficulties I found with it is that jazz chords are not easy and require more thought than I typically put into my chord progressions, but I did manage to figure it out eventually. I made the chord progressions far before I made the actual song, maybe like a month or two before I actually started on it. I started making this song around January, by the way. I'm gonna have to decipher these chords here. I don't actually know what I did exactly, but I'll figure it out. So to start off, the first chord progression starts with a C minor chord, and then I have a 7th and a 9th on top of that, I believe. Okay, I don't think this one is a 9th, but you get the idea. It's an extra note, makes it sound good. And I have the root note as the bass down here. And actually, the next chord after that is the C major over here, which has the same 7th and whatever this one is on top of it. And that was the basis for this first chord progression. I wanted to connect this minor chord with this major chord within the same chord progression. And I did that with these two chords here. I don't exactly remember the method I used to make these as the transition chords, but they are certainly there. And then for the second half of the chord progression, I have the first 3 chords with different bass notes. And the last chord of this half is very similar to the last chord of the first half, except I have that 7th raised up by 1 semitone, along with a completely different bass note. So if I play it here, I've got this. This is in 4/4 time, by the way, before I changed it to 5/4. And for the second chord progression that I used, it's just walking around the circle of fifths. This one also starts with a C minor. Yeah, some top melody notes as well, I forgot about that, but we can ignore that for now. And I believe it goes to an F minor from here, because that's what would make the most sense from this little image I got off the internet. And then I'm not sure what I did for this third one, because even though it looks like a C major chord, it's just an inversion of one of the chords that are closer to the C minor here. Either way, that moves to this chord over here. So once again, not exactly sure what I did with both of these chord progressions, but I do generally know the techniques I used for them. Once again, the first one was just a transition between a major and minor chord of the same root note, and this one is just walking around the circle of fifths in one way or another. And then from there, I finally put them into 5/4, so now we have this, with these transitions in between each chord to fill the empty space that would have been there. Along with that, I took this last chord from this first chord progression and put it into the second one. So this ends with that last chord there, with also a different top melody. So the second one now sounds like this. So initially those two chord progressions were supposed to be in a separate song, but I decided to put them together in this kind of idea track over here. So this is basically the first idea I had for this song, which is just supposed to kind of put together all the general elements I wanted to see in the song. Initially, this was supposed to be the calm that I mentioned in my last big video, which most of my subscribers would know about because that's where I got most of my subscribers from to begin with. It didn't really end up that way, but that was the initial idea. I didn't exactly know what I was going to do with the first chord progression, but the second one I knew I was going to go a sort of melodic dubstep-y route. So it's still pretty similar, or at least similar enough to this general idea here. And then if we go to the first try of this song, by this time I knew I wanted to have pretty complex sound design in the first drop, so that's what I have here. I'm not going to go over it because this is not the actual song, but you get the idea. This here was a failed attempt, which is also on my YouTube channel through this video right here. It's this video right here. This is in 5/4. This is also before I changed the general key of the song from starting off in C minor to something else. Finally, now we can get into the actual project file. So to start off on the intro, I have this piano, which I've used the strum on, and this chord chord progression is now 4 semitones higher starting at E. I've also half-timed it and put into 160 BPM, which is the BPM for the rest of the song. To start, it sounds like this. For the effects, I put some reverb on it, this EQ to take out some of the highs, this imager here so I could keep that piano a little more mono because for whatever reason Flex, which is the plugin I'm getting the piano from, I guess has the piano recorded so the high notes are like on one end of the stereo spectrum, so they're like on the left or something, and the lows are really far to the right. So I wanted to tame that with this ozone imager by just making everything a bit more mono. I have a sound goodizer for some extra loudness, and then this EQ here to take out some of the lows. The second thing I made was this little intro glitchy thing, just to add some extra texture into the song, made with phase plant, and this is a vocal sample of some kind. Taking off all the effects, this is what it sounds like. And I'm using this looping here so each note has the sample repeat a different amount of times, along with some bit crushing. Without that, and then I have this extra noise oscillator. I have an EQ to take out all the lows, and then this technique. The left and right of this is being controlled by this here, which is just a saw wave whose volume is being controlled by this Chaos 1. I have a peak controller on that, so this input is being taken in, and that is modulating this left and right thing. And finally, I have this kilohertz gate on it, just to get some extra volume change, so only some of it goes through. Next up, I have this little pluck here. And it's just playing a melody on top of the chords. And I made this little pluck for it, which has some weird distortion on it, because I want it to be a little extra crunchy. For the effects, I have even more distortion, some reverb, effectively a band pass so I can take out the highs and the lows, and then a delay on top of that to give it some, delay. But only with one repeat because I didn't want it to ring out too far. I've got some extra high-end support with this piano here, which has a whole lot of plugins on it. All of which just make it wider, louder, and keep it in the high end. And then a little ARP, which is made from this Vital patch I made, which is very simple. I have this main layer and then this one that resonates out a little bit longer afterwards, along with some multiband compression and some distortion, making it sound like this. And then on it, I have a crystallizer and a high pass. I believe the next thing I put in was this little percussive thing. Starting off with this, I put distortion, a transient shaper, a delay, and a pretty aggressive high and low pass. Next up, going into this pad here, I routed the intro piano into this area over here and put this delay on it, which has reverse chaos on, which not only plays the delays in forward and reverse, but also pitches them up and down in like sevenths and fifths and whatnot, I don't know. And I turned the diffusion way up so it could be more like a reverb, along with low passing and high passing, which sounds like this. Up next, I have this rain, just as an extra background element. And then I'm taking these chords from the intro piano, putting them through a MIDI out, and I have this rain routed to this pad area over here, to which I have a ton of effects, but the main one of which is this resonator, which is taking an input from that intro piano's MIDI. I have a vocodex on it to make it more watery. OTT, a whole lot of transient shaping so I can get a clicky kind of sound out of it. This kilohertz gate so I can suppress some of the sound. Now only some of it's coming through. I have a whole lot of disperser on it, which I got from a Skybreak video, a crystallizer, a fruity convolver for extra reverb, and this sort of chain to bring out the high end and give some extra bit of compression. I based an entire video around this, by the way, which is this video here. And then on top of all that, I have a respace going on to fill out the sub area. And then to finally get into the general effects of the whole area. In the very beginning, I have the stereo separation all the way down, so it's mono, and I have this Lifeline console on, along with the tape stop at the very beginning, and this Lifeline console just gives some extra wear and tear to make it sound like it's coming out of some really old audio device. I don't know the name, but you get the idea. And then over time, those both fade out, so it becomes more normal. Then I have these impacts over here, along with this volume automation, which is being modulated by this P controller, whose LFO speed is being turned down over time. This also has this little filter here to accentuate the effect, and a compressor because the volume automation effectively halves the volume, so I had to bring that back up. With all the elements, that sounds like this. First of all, for the next section, which is the break, this intro glitch has continued on, more importantly, into the main element here. I have the chords now in normal time instead of halftime, and they're going through the supersaw, which has some compression on it. I'm taking out some of the highs and all of the sub information and boosting this low mid-range. These saws are also a little bit in the intro, just to give that one section with the volume LFO some extra kick to it, I guess, which are transitioning with this reverb here. And then the main movement for this supersaw comes from this Serum Effects here, where I have an LFO on the volume and this filter over here, this low pass, along with some extra compression, and then that eventually gets filtered out into the buildup. Also, this has some portamento on it. I also have the pads filtering out here. Next up, I have this bass here, which is composed of two saw waves, some noise, and I also have some cutoff going on here for all their volumes and this filter with distortion, compression, and a high pass to take out all the sub information, which I replaced with the sub bass. This then goes into this EQ here, and I'm making it a little more mono. Then the LFO rate for all this modulation changes, so now I have it ringing out longer for the buildup. Then I have the sub bass over here, which is just a saw wave with some distortion, compression, and low passing to take out all that high end. I boost the sub a little extra and have this volume LFO on it, which then fades out as we get into the buildup. I then have the effects from the intro as a transition between the break and the buildup, along with some risers for the buildup. I also have a little snare up here, which has the low pass automation, volume automation, and its pitch is being changed over time. Most importantly for the section, I have this lead here, which is just made from a bell from Flex. And I have quite a few effects on this, a couple of which are being automated here. For example, I have the decay of this bell getting longer as we get into the buildup, and I'm decreasing the delay amount and increasing this distortion, which I have over here, not there, here, also as we get into the buildup. So it goes from this to this. So it's a lot more dry in the buildup, but it is getting supported by this other lead here, which is just a couple of square waves with some noise, and I'm automating this lower octave square wave. So instead of just sounding like this, it's given a sound that makes it seem like there's a filter on it, but it's just coming from this lower octave square wave and this distortion here. And then I've taken out all the sub information and decreased the high end, so I can let the high end from this other lead shine through. And then finally, on top of all of it, at the very end, as a transition between the buildup and the drop, I have this tape stop here. And all together, it sounds like this. Alright, so getting into the first drop, I'm just going to play it here so you can get a prerequisite idea of what's going on. Alright, so starting off, I'm gonna go to the drums first. To start off, I wanted to emulate this kind of drum beat, except in 5/4 time, so I tried my best to do that. Pretty much entirely just by ear, but I think I got close enough to what I was trying to get to. I didn't want the drums to be very heavy just because of the nature of the song, so I chose this pretty clicky kick. And that just has some boost in the low end along with a little bit of boost in the high end to get some extra click and a soft clipper. I also shortened the kick as like a secondary kind of kick just to give some extra rhythm to the area. And this snare is also pretty short with a very simple EQ. And similar to the kick, I made a small little supporting snare out of it just by shortening it up with this out knob just for some extra rhythm. I have a very simple hi-hat loop, just playing repeatedly. And this hi-hat has just some overdrive on it and some high passing to take out the lows that were added in through the overdrive over here. And then I have a couple other cymbals around the area just to accentuate the rhythm of the chord progression. Obviously, I have my side chain going along with the kicks and snares. And then over here at the second half of the drop, I have a tom fill. It's kind of subtle within the song, but it gives for a nice effect. And it just has some compression, distortion, low pass on it, and an ozone imager to make it more mono. And then over here, I created a fill out of the kicks and snares to transition from drop to the next section of the song. This sub bass is just a saw wave with some noise and distortion and compression and whatnot, and a low pass to take out the high end. So getting into the sound design aspect of the first drop. Alright, first up I have this chord stack. This chord stack is just using the first chords in the chord progression for every 4 bars. The patch is very simple if I can just take these effects off first. So this is just a super saw patch with an extra octave on top of it and a peak filter along with a low pass that is after a compressor. And then that's going into this EQ with a high pass, a mid-side EQ to just tame the side a little bit, an OTT, and another EQ to boost this mid-range a bit. And then that filter changes just a little bit over here, where it's just a little extra extreme. And the extremeness of that filter is just being controlled by this macro, which I have automated over here. Next is this very simple ARP, which is just a couple of asymmetric square waves, along with an octave automation, which you can hear here if I turn this LFO rate down. And that's going on 1/4 very quickly, so you get this kind of 8-bit clicky sound. It's not clicky, I don't know how to describe it, but you get the idea. And then that's just playing an arpeggiated chord. That's also going on during the main bass of the second half of, I guess, this little 4-bar interval here. If I put the effects back on, which I have an EQ, and this patcher here, which I'm not sure why I used the whole patcher for it, but it's just this delay, which adds some extra reverb for that specific section, so I can add some tonal wideness to this general area over here. And the last very simple one is just this extra square wave kind of bleep, or at least it sounded like a square wave. It's actually made up of a saw wave and triangle wave with some distortion and compression, and that's got a little bit of an EQ on it just to boost some mids, some highs, and take out all the low. Taking out all the low on all my stuff, by the way, makes space for the sub, if you hadn't noticed, I guess. And that is just following the notes of these filler chords that I have in the original chord progression. So it's taking the role of those chords and filling in the gaps within the drop. Moving on to the more complicated stuff, I have some kind of complex sound design over here. And I guess the bass layer or bass sound I used for this is coming from the Slice X, which is just slicing up a bass I made in a bass jam. And since I'm not AU5, I'm actually going to show you how I made it, instead of just saying it's from a bass jam and just not elaborating. So let me go over exactly what I did. It's pretty simple. It's just an LFO on this octave here. In the oscillator editor, I just have, a sine wave for every harmonic, besides, I guess, this one. And that is being FM'd from this triangle wave. And this one, this LFO is on the volume there. And then I have some extra EQing, multi-beam compression, ping pong delay, and some stereo width. That is going into a frequency shifter, taking it down into a vocodex, which you can hear the sound really coming into its own at this point, in OTT. The snap heap, which has like 10 dispersers in it, which I got from a Skybreak tutorial at like half level. Crystallizer for some extra width. I'm turning the width even higher with this ozone imager, and then I increase the mono a little bit with this mid-side EQ, some EQing, just to get that extra high end, and of course more high end with this fresh air. So going back into this project, I put that thing that I showed you into a fruity granulizer, and then I put that into the Slice X and just these being pitched down quite a bit. So I just put whatever I thought sounded cool, strung them together, and I got this as an output. And then next up, I have this analog BD sign, which is coming from the stock serum wavetables, playing some chords, which are getting fed into here. They have a high pass on them, and that is being put into this effects chain. So we have this initial sound, along with those sine wave chords, going into a vocodex. Classic color-based bass design right there. Some compression through OTT and Sound Equalizer. Major EQing because I wanted to get a specific tone out of this vocodex. I made it completely mono, put some extra weird stuff on it, along with some level automation. So yeah, this is where all the movement of the bass comes from, and then a simple compressor at the end. And then this initial sound is also going into a resonator layer, playing the same chords, with some major EQing. I wanted this one to have a lot of high end compared to the other one, mainly consisting of mid and low tones. An ozone imager bringing all the stereo down. This is the same serum effects on the vocoder chain, and then once again, a compressor. The vocodex and the resonator layer sound like this. And then I have extra processing, compression, this fresh air here to bring out more high end. This snap heap again with all the dispersers on it to about, what, 60%? Which gives it even more movement. I'm bringing the width back up, heavily suppressing some frequencies with this TDR Nova. More compression, EQing, crystallizer at the end to make it cooler. And then the initial sound is going into another EQ, along with the crystallizer just to give some extra sound to the sound. And then after that, there are even more effects, just cleaning it up, adding tons of compression, you know, messing with the stereo image, monitoring some stuff with this span. And then this at the end as like a cap to the chain. Very loud now compared to earlier. One thing that I have a major problem with is this EQ right here. I probably spent like an hour and a half just on this EQ straight, an hour and a half straight, just messing with this. And then the next day I come back and it sounds perfectly fine. It still sounds kind of iffy, but I'm okay with it. So it doesn't matter. And I also have this little transient layer made out of, once again, this high end, which if I turn on, sounds like this. Has a lot of effects on it, mainly transient shapers to make it more transient, some extra distortion, an EQ to bring it way down because it was way too loud after all that transient shaping. I made it wider with this, and some mid-side EQing. It's also turned quite down, so I might as well have just omitted it entirely, but I decided to keep it, not sure why. It doesn't make that much of a difference for the overall sound. And then for the second half of the drop, I have some more effects on this, which overall sound like this. What I have here is a frequency shifter going on, doing its job. Just has some variation, and then this kilohertz delay, which I'm using in a very cool way. I also have a video on that specific technique. All right, next bass. So this is coming from the same Slice X as the first one, and now I have quite a bit of layering of these little individual blips of sound. And the second half of this has some extra transient type sounds and some quite long extra ones just on top of everything. So immediately I have some distortion in the form of a fat rack to bring the volume way up, and compression along with volume automation, specifically for this part over here to curb its release time, I guess. Making it more concise. From here, I have a similar technique to the bass above it, in which I am now using a triangle wave for these chords here, which are then getting fed into a vocodex over here. Then some compression with an OTT, major EQ shaping because I wanted this vocodex to have this specific mid-tone. So the resonator could take the high-end formant filter to accentuate that mid-tone from the EQ, and then I'm making it completely mono so I can shape the stereo spectrum how I want to later. This initial sound is also going into a resonator, which has slightly different chords in the fact that they just don't have this lower bass note. A formant filter. I'm once again making it completely mono. And I'm just taking out all the lows to make space for a sub bass. Together that sounds like this. And then I have extra effects on it like this this band reject. I have 3 OTTs on it. They're all at 50%. More compression with the sound goodizer. And then this wild EQ over here, bringing out this low mid-range and the high end, along with taking out all the sub-bass region. This is then going into the effects over here, and then this initial Slice X sound is also going into something over here, so it can be used as a layer. This is a mid-side EQ, and I'm just taking out the sub-region again. Together they sound like this. And then that's all going into this effect chain, this patcher of which I will talk about later. Compression, once again this snap heap, transient shaping, some more EQing, fresh air bringing out more high end. Mid-side EQ, and then this delay is specifically for this reason right here. If I play the drop without that delay, that region just sounds very dull and empty even with this arpeggio being reverbed over here. And so I have this delay on, which is being used as a reverb to give all that extra space that I thought I required, making it a whole lot bigger and wider than before. And then of course the chords are following the chord progression. Over here, I have the delay being turned off, along with this initial patcher that I was talking about over here being turned back on. Just for some variation in the second half of the drop, mainly using this resonator here, along with some mild frequency shifting, which would sound like this without it. But I want it to be a little deeper toned. So there goes that. There's an effector here, and a fat rack before the resonator, all of which is being EQ'd to my liking. And then on top of that, in the second half of the drop, I have the leads being back, the leads from the build-up, which are being slightly EQ'd with a low pass. Here and here, specifically to make space for this bass down here. If I turn that on, you can hear it more evidently. And then I have that EQ again over here just as a transition when you hear this this drum fill up here. And then for the third overall drop, I have some variation going on. With this chord stack, it was accidental. Initially, it sounds like this. And then over here, it sounds like this. Which is just because this LFO that's controlling this filter and this filter is on off instead of trigger. So it triggers based off the specific bar that it's on. And it's triggering differently because I have this little break in between, which I will go over later. And then along with that as the last bit of variation for this bass over here. These chords are now being arpeggiated. I forgot to mention, at least on the second version of this drop, I have a tape stop at the very end. Just as a very simple transition because I didn't know how else to transition from the drop to the outro. Alright, for the second more melodic drop, to start off as a transition from the build up to the drop, instead of using the tape stop, I wanted to make it a bit more flowy, I guess. So I used the low pass automation. And that returns to normal over the course of 2 bars. Along with that, I have a transition with these crashes over here. This bandwidth for the crashes and this bandwidth up here for the kicks is just this automation here. So I'm just taking out the high end. Same with over here once again. Also have different drums here. I'm using a heavier kick. Instead of this one, I'm using this one. And a completely different snare with quite a bit of reverb on it, which just has some very basic effects on it. Including this one, which just accentuates that fundamental. The cymbals in this section are also incredibly simple. It's just this ride here, which is very splashy. Along with, of course, this crash over here. And then all the other cymbals I have muted for now. I had this automation here for, I think, the chords. But then I decided to not use it because it sounded like trash. Also, another thing to mention before I get into the sound design of this part of the drop, I don't believe I mentioned it before either, but in each one of my drops I have each part split into two sections, which is a call and response between one section and the other, which I also have going on in the second drop between the chord stacks, where I have a lot more choppy in the first half of the section, and then more sustained throughout the second half. So that's why these chords are chopped off around here. Same with the cymbals. And then the snare is filling out the silence where the chords and whatnot were chopped. But I have the reverb ducked out completely as we get into the next half of that half. And then everything opens up upon the second half of the section. Continuing on, let me start with the chords first. So first of all, I'm using that second chord progression that I mentioned quite a while ago. And this consists of about 4 layers. I have a quite high layer here. This other saw layer, which I got from an AU5 tutorial, which uses the chaos options as a modulator to the pitch of each of these oscillators, giving it some extra grittiness, but I have it quite high pass because I just wanted the kind of high-end airy quality to it, to give the chord stack some more noise and therefore impact in the high end. Then I have a pretty normal layer here, which is just a normal super saw with some high passing and then some extra low passing because I already had the high end coming from these two above it. And then a bit of a lower saw layer, which also has a high pass on it. Altogether those sound like this, which is quite full, which is what I wanted. Added some stereo shaping to that to get the slightest bit more mono input into the chord stack. And then I have this EQ to give some space for the lead that I'll talk about momentarily here, and just a little extra high end. Along with that, I have this pitch bend here at the beginning of the sustain part. I also have this square wavy bass from earlier back, just to fill in the gaps in the chord progression. And this bass layer for the chord stacks, which is just made out of a couple of saw waves, one with an octave below, some bright white noise, and tons of distortion. Then I have a fat rack on it. This EQ to take out the low end for the sub bass and some of the extra high end. A Serum Effects putting some stereo wideness on it through this hyperdimension. A mid-side EQ to take out some of the sides to make it a little bit more mono. And then finally another EQ taking out quite a bit of the high end. And then finally for the sub, I believe this is the same sub as earlier. And then I have this arpeggio layer for the more sustained sections of the drop, which is literally just a square wave, taking out all the low end and then just panning it from left to right. And then for these leads, which is probably my favorite part, they are just square wave leads with this portamento on. And then I have the main one. And then the second one is just playing a harmony for it, and so they sound cool. I also have this pitch bend, which just gives it some extra character by bending between, for example, this note here and this note here. And then I have this volume automation, which I will talk about momentarily after just some effects. For example, I have an OTT on it, this EQ to boost the fundamental of the leads, and then this delay to give it some extra wideness. I'm also automating this fruity balance over here to take out all the volume here in the choppier section of the drop. I also have this section right here, just to add some variation to the drop. So in here I have all the cymbals muted, and the first drop's drums because they're quite a bit thinner, I guess. I also have all of the reverb from the delay off. The chords are completely gone. So is this bass layer for the drop. And I have this patcher on just for that specific section, adding distortion to the sub bass to make it a lot more gritty. And then that just transitions directly back into the normal drop with this big old snare over here. And then I have a sort of transitional section over here where I get rid of all the drums. And a tape stop here. And then because I didn't know how to transition between the second drop here and the first drop, which I have copied over here, I have this little break section, which has a little drum fill. And then all of the drums get cut out around here for the vine boom. I have some other goofy sounds that also have this resonator on it. This resonator is getting its MIDI input from the chords from the first drop, or just, I guess, a chord from the first drop. And I also have the certified hood classic vocal in there as well.
This is a certified hood classic,
which gets cut off for the vine boom. And that is a transition into the first drop, or I guess the second first drop, if you will. Alright, and finally for the outro, I have once again another tape stop. And I have effects from the intro coming in, specifically this stereo separation getting turned down quite a bit to make it completely mono, and then the Lifeline console coming back in. I also have the rain returning, along with this ARP here. I have a flute, which is just coming from Flex, and it has some, you know, effects on it. I have some violins also coming from Flex, with some compression from OTT, and this EQ shape. I have these horns here, with some OTT and also distortion. And then I have a tuba with some OTT. I'm taking out some of the high ends and boosting some of these low mid bass areas and some distortion. And then that transitions into just the two pianos from the intro. And then finally for the mastering and whatnot, I have the first drop recorded here with a tape stop on it, bit crushing, this EQ, and I'm making it completely mono. And I've chopped it up quite a bit, just as the very beginning of the song. And then for mastering, I have some, basically this is just a multi-band limiter, I guess, instead of a compressor, but you get the idea. An exciter, this EQ, stereo imaging, taking out all the lows from the side channel, and some final limiting at the very end. And that is it for the breakdown of this song. You can listen to it on all platforms besides SoundCloud, which is not my fault, that's just how DistroKid works. And I should also have a visualizer of it on my YouTube channel, so go ahead and stream it. That's all for now. Hope you learned something. Peace.